Hello again. Today's project is the Flounced skirt for Cowboy Peach. The entirety of this costuming endeavor took approximately 14 yards of the cotton linen blend I selected, with almost 12 of those dedicated to this skirt. As mentioned in my earlier videos, this skirt pattern is from Truly Victorian and was a delight to work with. The base of the skirt is cut out of large rectangles with the top edge shaped slightly to accommodate the difference between front and back. This was a lot less extreme compared to the elliptical styles of the 1860s, but the pattern provided measurements for both. The base skirt goes together very simply. Since all the side seams are straight, it's an absolute cinch to get them together in no time. The only trick is making sure you don't roll over your fabric with your chair while you're sewing. The skirt was also hemmed before any of the flounces or waistband were attached for ease. I buried the ends of the machine thread for a cleaner look. So I am working on the back of the skirt, and in the original pattern this is supposed to be a seam that you stop sewing about 9 inches down and then fold back ½ an inch on each side. But because I'm having to alter it to fit the larger hoop skirt that I'm working with, the back is actually comprised of a shortened panel. It's half the size of the regular panels, meaning that it doesn't have a seam that I can work with. So instead, my plan is, and hopefully this works, is to make a little fold over here. I've marked down the required length and marked ½ an inch out on each side. And my plan is to sew down around the edges of this and then turn it inside out to create a nice clean seam that hopefully won't fray or look very bad. So, fingers crossed that that's actually going to work. I realize I have made a minor miscalculation. Because I'll be turning this back, this seam will be fine, but this raw edge is still going to be raw. So, I'm going to have to do the fiddly task of folding this back a couple times to make sure that it's not gonna go anywhere. Maybe I'll just overlock the edge and fold it under one, because I don't know if I'm getting 2 folds out of this little bad boy right here. But learn from my mistakes. Don't do things out of order. So the opening has been cut open, which was terrifying, and I've now folded it back. I don't know what I was on about, worrying about needing to fold it back twice. Folding it back once and stitching it down will close up the raw edge. I overlocked it anyways because I couldn't think about it at the time of. My visualization is not always the best, but I got it back, and now I'm just going to stitch around the edge. I'm undecided on whether I want to stitch it by hand or by machine. I'm probably going to do machine just because I'm lazy, and since it's one layer, the stitching will show no matter what. But my biggest worry right now is the fact that this seems so wide. I mean, the pattern says to cut down the middle and fold it back 1/2 inch, and these were folded back 1/2 inch. They look wider because the piece of fabric was bigger, but they're folded back 1/2 inch, which is what the pattern said, but I am dubious, I think.
Next were the flounces, which start very much the same as the larger skirt.
So I have just finished marking out my first line to fold up for the hem, and I've realized that if I'm going to do this, I need to overlock my seams first to make sure that they don't fray before I do this. Otherwise, I am going to make my life 1,000 times more difficult. So I'm going to pause on this and push all of my seams through the overlock on my sewing machine, and then come back.
To accommodate this pause, I'm ironing my seams open and then to one side for overlocking. They are pushed to one side so both sides can be fed through at once to speed things up a bit. However, you may have noticed an even greater mistake I have not realized yet. Do you have any guesses what it is?
Alright, I have returned. All of my seams have been overlocked. And I just wanted to clarify a couple things. First, I don't have a serger. I use an overlock on my sewing machine. It's a specialty foot and stitch that has to be pre-cut and just goes over the edge. It doesn't trim things like a serger does. The other thing is that in the instructions it says to sew this whole thing up into a circle and then finish the hem. I'm not doing that because I hate having to iron things that are circles because I lose a lot of the flexibility of being able to just kind of like throw the fabric around wherever I want. I have to worry about like bunching up and getting into like a weird shape. So my plan is to do the hem first and then sew up the final edge and then overlock the final edge after I've hemmed. It'll be a little bit bulky where I folded it up, but my sewing machine usually doesn't have problems with that, so I'm just kind of going for it. So for this next part, I'm going to be doing the exact same process that I did for the base of the skirt, which is folding out this hem that I've marked, and I'm using a piece of kind of stiff, like cardstock material, maybe a little bit stiffer than cardstock, to help get that more sharp line. The cut obviously is not perfect, but it's still going to be better than me trying to look for it by hand and folding it over. And I found that generally just streamlines the process a little bit. So I am going to do that for this, and then presumably all of the other pieces. This will take, I imagine, about 8,000 years. Hello friends, I have stopped what I've been doing because I have realized that I have a problem. So in the original art, the skirt tiers have a band of a darker colored pink, which I have the fabric for, but kind of forgot that I needed to incorporate in the construction of this skirt while I was making it. So I have 2 of my tiers of ruffles hemmed at the bottom, but not connected. And I have 1 of them fully connected and possibly ready to go. I have not folded over the top on any of them yet to do the cord gathering that the instructions require, but I have essentially stopped everything until I figure out how I am going to apply those bands. I've been doing some math to figure out how big I need everything to be. I'm currently thinking about 2 inches on the upper bands and 3 inches on the final one, since it's a bit larger, both in the illustration and in the pattern I'm using. That being said, I think my best bet for attaching these bands is to make sort of like a pseudo bias tape, obviously much bigger than a bias tape, but to cut pieces larger, fold over the edge, stitch that down, fold over, and then flip to the underside, fold that over, and stitch down. I think I am going to have to hand stitch the back down, so I only am catching the hem here and not the over fabric. I personally don't think stitching in the dish is going to look good here. So my current maths, as it were, my top 2 ruffles are the same base width, and I'm multiplying that by how long they are once I've cut all of them out. And then I did the same thing for my bottom ruffle. Interestingly enough, it is actually slightly smaller than my top ruffles, but it calls for more to be cut out, so it's still a little bit bigger. Oh, speaking now and looking at this, I realize I also need to factor in my seam allowances. I'm glad I'm talking to you about this, because I would have completely forgot. Okay.
After considerable effort, I cut the strips for the flounce trim out, and proceeded to fold over the edges with the same technique I used for the other parts of the skirt. I measured up from the hemmed edge to make sure, even if my ironing or measurements were off, the outside edge was even all the way across. After sewing, I ironed it down to look crisp. This part is pretty important since, as a thoroughly synthetic fabric, it requires a lot of coercing to mold into a new shape. The fabric was then folded over the edge and ironed again to hold its shape, thus concealing the raw edge that had previously been ironed into it. Finally, all 3 yards, totaling close to 8 yards in length, were hand sewn along the back. Since this was only sewn through the hem on the back, it's totally invisible from the front. This was sewn with a very wide whip stitch, or something close to a hem stitch. As the last step for the flounces, a cord was sewn into a channel along the topmost section to create a secure way to gather down the flounces to the skirt. This was done with a zipper foot and a 1/16 piping cord. After these had finally been sewn into their respective loops and finished, I chose to break them into segments to gather them down more evenly and easily. Since they were massive, I employed my boyfriend Sean's help for the following sections. The fabric was folded over into half, then fourths, then eighths, and each of these was marked with a pin. The same process was done to the base skirt so I could match up these markings later. The skirt was loosely pinned to my dress form galatea for the next few days. I have a terrible habit of accidentally pinning and sewing through multiple layers if they're stacked on top of each other. Plus, with the amount of pins in the skirt at this moment, the likelihood I'd get stabbed by one if I sewed it flat was astronomical. Instead, I simply pinned on my flounces one at a time, sewing each as I went. In the original instructions, Truly Victorian tells you to use a sewing machine to attach the flounces, the same as you did for sewing and the cording. But I was worried about a lack of control and the aesthetics if I did that, so instead I opted for the much longer route of hand sewing. This took days between gathering, pinning, and stitching.
So I've just finished gathering everything up, but I realized I didn't actually show the mechanism by which everything is gathered. So on the underside here, there's this cord, and it was sewn right here along the edge with a zipper foot to create this really thin casing. And then all you gotta do to gather it is just pull the cord to gather it down to the width of the skirt. So I pre-gathered mine and set it on top of this dress form, and then I just ungathered it to match the markings that I set up with pins. I did 8 on this and 8 on this, and just matched those and had it match up. And now I'm done.
For the final part of the skirt, I needed to gather down the top and apply the waistband. The waistband here was a simple waistband of 2 sewn rectangles. I do wish I had better enforced this during the making, but it functions just fine anyways. During the 1850s and 1860s especially, cartridge pleating was one of the most popular methods for getting a ton of fabric into a very little space. Basically, the fabric is folded over a bit, and then a very large running stitch is taken evenly across the entire top of the fold at increments of 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch. It could be wider or smaller depending on how thick your fabric was. Sometimes padding would be added to give a fuller, more lush appearance to these. These stitches would then be gathered up, creating these little rows of fabric like you see in the video. The outside edge of each of these pleats is caught with the thread and sewn to the waistband with a whip stitch. I realize my original footage of this is a little stuttery, so let me do a better demonstration. When it's all sewn up and secured, you gently tug on the waistband to center the folds and get them to hang nicely from the bottom edge.
So it has occurred to me that I have not inserted any pockets into this skirt, even though it is pretty much finished. So I'm going to take a few minutes, review Miss Bernadette Banner's video on pockets, and put some pockets in this bad boy so I can actually carry things for once. Won't that be novel?
As my very last effort for this skirt, I began the pocket in earnest. I highly recommend you look at Bernadette Banner's pocket video for instructions about this, as I followed her almost verbatim. The only thing I can truly add is to make the pocket bigger than you think. I thought this pocket was astronomically large, which it was compared to my normal pockets, but which fell short of the deep, full pockets of my dreams. Especially in a larger hoop skirt like this, where bulk won't affect anything, make your pockets stupidly large, with big openings for your hands. My pocket was assembled with French seams, and I left the seam facing toward the outside of the pocket because it both sat better and wouldn't be felt when I used it. The skirt also did have to be seam ripped a little bit to let the pocket in, an experience which I think may have took a couple of years off of my life.
Alright, it has been installed with some somewhat messy back stitches and then a little zigzag over the new open split since this was previously overlocked. So now all I have to do is turn it inside out and hope to God that it actually works. The pocket has been installed and ironed down. It took me a couple tries. This little area down here at the bottom was not wanting to sit flat. It was bulging out because I hadn't given enough room for it to come out and down. So I ended up having to split the seam allowance a little bit further and go back in with my handwork to finish it up. But it is now done. It is beautiful and I can do this. I think I'm only going to do the one because that was kind of a pain in the ass. But now I've got a pocket to put things in, so feeling pretty good.
And at long last, it was time to try on my very fancy new skirt.